Yeah, well, thank you. So I'm Dr. Andrew Milacci, and I just want to say thanks so much to the library and Rachel and to Hannah and everybody. It's been a wonderful experience, and I'm a little embarrassed when I walk into the library because I was like, wow, my pictures are... I was like, it was an awesome experience, but yeah. So I kind of was enjoying it, kind of embarrassed, and you got to be humble. So yeah, but anyways, as you heard, I teach Spanish actually, but one of my main research areas, right now the main research area I'm in is Brazilian poetry. It's poetry that stems back a little over 150 years, but it comes from Spain and Portugal anyways. There's a long tradition of that. Have you ever seen wanted posters that they hang on walls, or like big announcements, like the poster tradition we have really all stems back to this type of similar origin in which we try and put things at people's eye level to it's the cheapest, best marketing you can do in a way with the catchy title that's alliterated, like every sermon, and with some really catchy graphics in stark colors, so I'm doing good practice here. And my research is about a specific type of folklore or folk poetry that's called literatura de cordel. And so it's from the Portuguese. It means string literature. So cordel, like the word chord, right? So it makes sense. And it exists in Spanish as well. But the way that it exists nowadays and has come through a long tradition really is a very Brazilian phenomenon. And it's particular to a specific swath of about 9 states in the northeast of Brazil. So if you can imagine Brazil and how it juts out on the Atlantic coast, basically that whole northern half of the country to the east is where this poetry belongs to. And from there it spread out through a lot of the country. For a while it's stigmatized. Would you believe that the very first dictionary entry of the word cordel as used as literature, not for a piece of string, it said a literary genre of little importance. And I was like, oh my gosh. So we have that, and it's all digitized now. And so, things change. And nowadays, it's got a lot of attention from scholars. And you might be wondering, well, how does Bullets, Bandits, and Beauty, besides being alliterated, I'm the son of a pastor, so, that makes sense. But Bullets and Bandits go together nicely, right? But what does beauty have to do with it? Well, art is beautiful, so poetry is a form of art. And then one of the interesting things we're going to find out is that this bandit that we're going to be talking about today, and it's all going to tie together, I promise. This bandit we're going to be talking about, how he's viewed and written about and then consumed in literature. His, not really wife, but his companion, his partner, his girlfriend, her name was Maria Bonita. Does anybody know any? It's the same word in Spanish, so her name is Pretty or Beautiful Mary. So not Bloody Mary, she's Pretty Mary. And he was willing to stack her up against anybody as the most beautiful on earth. And we'll actually, in all time even, we'll even see a poem in which he goes back in time to the foundation of society and compares her to the very first humans, our first mother and father, Adam and Eve. And says, even the God perfectly created Eve can't stand up to her. So we're going to talk today about how bandits and poetry come together to form something that has kind of eclipsed historical reality. Because if we were to think about what bandits are, they're not somebody that we really want to be involved with, right? And if we think about what poetry is, you don't think that people are going to be writing about bandits in poetry, am I right? So what are some common things people might write about in their poetry? Like love. Yeah, come on. Taylor Swift wasn't the first one. So it's love, religion, so the most important institutions, so love and God. Anything else? Nature, like landscapes, hope, all those type of things, right? And then maybe hate. Some of the most extreme things you can think of. And then after that, the list gets pretty small. It's like a cliff. You got these big models, these huge topics everybody talks about. Then after that, are people writing about chairs? No, people aren't writing about cameras. People aren't writing about you or me. Maybe someday they will. Hopefully for good reasons. But in poetry, we have these big topics. And while my specialty isn't English poetry or any other poetry, to be honest with you, I would say we can be pretty confident that nobody's written thousands and upon thousands, and not millions of poems about love, things like they have about love, right? So, would you believe that after God, love, hope, patriotism, nature, all these things, a bandit is one of the most common, now you, of course, you're here. So bandit is perhaps one of the most common topics of poetry in Brazil. There's really conservative estimates that 1,500 of this one specific type of poetry has been written about him. 1,500 different. I can't think of anything else that has 1,500 anything about it. I mean, maybe on the internet and stuff now, but like a single person got 1,500 poems dedicated to them in a very specific poetry tradition. It's kind of a rarity, and I would put that against many other traditions. Like, what other single person, maybe, of course, I'm grouping like Christ, of course, and with God and religion. So yeah, he is probably the most common topic, and it wasn't always that way, but he's been around for now 100 years in this poetry. So, you've heard of these people, right? Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Bonnie and Clyde. When you think about them, you're not scared of them. They're kind of cool. They roped cattle, they robbed banks, and they killed people. But that was a long time ago, and whatever, right? But they're fascinating. Bonnie and Clyde, for a while, they were really in the public eye, and people kind of like wanted them to win because they were like this love story. And then they started to get really violent, and then people were like, no, well, they got to get caught. And you know how they met their end? They were shot down in their car. And we have pictures of that and stuff today. So, in the end, bandits, they are what they are, but they still fascinate us. So why do you... before I move on to the next one, but do you know about Lampião? This is the guy we're talking about today. He's the most fearsome bandit of Brazil. And I say most fearsome because everybody accepts it, but there were actually people in his group that were just way more cruel, people who came before him who were much, much more quick on the trigger. But he is, just for the sheer amount that he operated, the length of time he was in power, and the amount of people he commanded, we just call him the number one. Okay, he was, without a doubt, he's always called the king of bandits in Brazil. O rei do cangaço. The word cangaço comes from the word like kangaroo. You know how the kangaroo has a pouch? Canga is like a bag. So cangaço is the bandits who carried the bag, or cangaceiro. So if you hear that word cangaço or cangaceiro, is referring to the type of bandits they are. So bandits of Brazil. In my thing up front, I said Brazilian cowboys, but they're bandits, okay? And they deal with cows too. But he looks like a bad guy, right? He looks like he could be an author. Every author's got their smoking picture. But that's his band. That's actually not all of it. Estimates put his band as much as like 100 at a time. Some people like to say he got 200 to 400. We don't really think that, but there was a lot. But we do know is at any given time there were dozens and dozens of people riding with him. And then he had franchises. He had sub-commandants and sub-lieutenants who would go around in other parts. And they'd spend thousands of square kilometers of Brazilian desert. In this region called the Northeast, Nordeste, there's a very wide swath. It's one of the larger climate regions of the Northeast. It's called the Sertão. A lot of Portuguese today. We'll just call it the Sertão, and it's the Brazilian backlands desert. Cacti, very thorny bushes and stuff everywhere. Can you imagine this in your mind? I could have put it up there. You got it in the background. It's, okay? So it's a desert. It's not quite like Sahara. It's got a lot more vegetation. And it's subject to massive droughts followed by torrential downpours. And funny enough, the people who live there, they never want to leave. People feel very close to the land. There's literature and there's stories. There's everything you can imagine written about this region. And it's just, people feel very connected to it. And so this man, he operated in that area. And what we're going to talk about then is a little bit about the background of banditry and how it came to be, and then exactly what that looks like in this poetry. Okay? So maybe it's because, why are we so fascinated with bandits? Maybe because, we're pretty far away from them. We don't really have bandits nowadays, thank God. But the ultimate question I have for you is, if you think bandits are cool, I kind of think they're cool, but I would never want to bump into one in a dark alley with my pockets full of cash. Am I right? Yeah, Lampião, his first big deed, within months of becoming the head of his own gang, he took over the gang from somebody else. The guy actually retired, and he just went and died in natural life. And can you believe that? He's like, I'm done. He retired. So Lampião took over his band, and the first thing he did is he went to a huge estate where the woman who owned it, she was a widow, and he ripped the gold chain right off her neck, and he wore it for years after that. So that's one of his first things that made news. And so yeah, he'll take your money, he'll take your gold chain right off your neck, even if you're an elderly widow. So banditry, it's interesting to think about. Why don't we have bandits nowadays? Well, basically nowadays, particularly in this country, We have, and not saying anything about any other country, but we have a very stable society full of law and order. We more or less abide by these rules. The majority of countries pretty much are ruled by law and order, I guess you would say nowadays. But in the past, whenever we didn't have the ability to communicate across thousands of miles quickly or travel thousands of miles quickly, it was very easy for pockets of land to become isolated. You know what I mean? And they said, like, West Virginia, for example, maintained like a Shakespearean accent for years because of the mountains surrounding it. I don't know if that's actually a thing, but that's what I'm talking about, is that the isolation and the lack of technology to cross that isolation meant that these cut-off swaths of land operated under, well, again, without a whole lot of law and order. And what's more, so we'll see that here, banditry crops up where the power structures and law and order really aren't that stable. But what's also crazy is that the bandits, in the first point there, I should have probably swapped them, right? The bandits ultimately, makes sense, they challenge that system. By existing and then not getting caught, they're laughing in the face of the powers that be. The man, the establishment, the police, they can't catch them. They're even getting, they're beat by them, dying in front of them. And because they know the lands, and the police might have come from another state to serve at that post. And so, yeah, the bandits ultimately undermine an already undermined system. They destabilize it further. And so what ends up happening is you have this power struggle between them. And caught in the middle of all that are normal citizens like you and me, who are trying to define themselves in this space that's being contested for power structures, that's already destabilized. And the citizens, they're like, well, I'm not the one holding the power. I know that for a fact because I barely can put bread on my table. I'm closest to the bandits. And so a lot of common people ended up identifying themselves in this sort of reversed Lacanian mirror. If you know of Jacques Lacan, he said there's a mirror stage in life, and where, like, when we can recognize ourselves as the person in the mirror, it's kind of like a developmental thing. And so we have this opposite Lacanian mirror, which is this normal citizen inside the law sees the bandit and says, and they don't see themselves as the other person, they see the other as themselves. So rather than, I'm the one in the mirror, they said, no, the person in the mirror, well, it kind of allows me to identify myself in juxtaposition to themselves under this law structure. So we will see then that Maria Bonita, she actually ended up sort of crossing that mirror. She started to follow Lampião, became obsessed with him, left her, not a very good husband, but he was still a normal, respectable husband. And he had a job, and she just abandoned him one day and went off to the desert with Lampião because she crossed that mirror of identification with banditry. So ultimately then, one thing I want to point out is something you may not have realized. Not all bandits are actually bandits. If you thought about how you define a bandit, what's the difference between a bandit versus a gangster or a mobster or a petty thief or a criminal? Like, of course, there has to be a gang involved. But then we get into semantics. And would you also believe that the people who were in control of these power structures in the area, they were able to leverage language and discourse, just like we do in politics nowadays, for their own personal benefit. And as they saw power being wrestled away from them, they could use the term bandits, because it strikes fear into people's hearts, as like this revolutionary but bad revolutionary. They could leverage the term bandit indiscriminately. And so they would call people bandits, and if you can, who not necessarily were bandits. Does that make sense? So you might not actually be a bandit, but if they called you a bandit, you're a bandit. And that's actually a working definition that a lot of scholars use, particularly this Juan Pablo Dabov and his multiple books on banditry. He's like, a bandit is anyone called bandits in history. So basically then, they actively engage in criminal activity or not, and they call themselves a bandit, or maybe they're called a bandit. And so bandits either self-create through their actions, or they're created by a discourse put upon them. Okay? And along the same lines, Lampião created his own legacy, but I'm going to show you how the poetry also created a new legacy for him. See how this is all tied together? All right. Okay. And like I said, our distance from history allows us to admire them, with a little bit of a more friendly gaze. But again, we never want to do that, to be up next to them. And the interesting thing about history is that with this distance, the lens of history can become clouded. Would you agree with me that, not like you're not always sure. You hear something like, can that really be real? Or who really said that? Or who was funding that particular research? You ever had that question when it comes to research and whatnot? Well, when we talk about history, we often say, well, history is written by the victors. And that's kind of cynical, kind of true, right? And it brings up this question, can we actually trust history? I'm not trying to tear down history. I love history, and it's part of what we do. And we have to know our own history. But if it's true that those who write history, they can, again, like I said, they can label certain people as others or as bandits or whatever, and put that on the historical record. Isn't that an interesting thought, that the writers of history might have had agendas behind them, and the things that we accept what they said simply because they're the ones speaking? And so, what does this say about the possible of getting to truth in history? Well, it's not always considered as truth with a capital T. Sometimes it's someone's particular truth, right? And that also means that if someone can change the official narrative, that can become history. That is, again, what I'm trying to say about the poetry of the Cordel, is that they were able to overcome the official narratives about Lampião and change the historical record. So, has anybody ever heard of what's called the Mechanical Turk? It's this. It's like this robot that people thought for a long time was like an automaton that, like in the 18th and 19th centuries, that could like move chessboard and could be a human in chess. Well, it was just actually a guy hiding in a box moving pieces. And so that's what this one critic named Walter Benjamin, he said. It's, again, a little cynical. He says, well, history is just that. It's a guy hiding in a box moving the pieces. And that's what historical record is. It's a big manipulative hand. I don't think that's exactly the case, but it's interesting to think of. I like his second point, where he says history isn't the timeline, it's a catastrophic mess, where layers upon layers are stacked upon each other. If you've ever heard the word palimpsest, they just found a biblical palimpsest, by the way, a lost chapter of the Bible or something, or one that we hadn't had for a long time. And it's whenever someone scratches off a layer of ink on papyrus to reuse it and use it again. And so he says history is like a palimpsest, which we're constantly rewriting and erasing and then rewriting. And I think Liberty's campus is very palimpsestic because there's a lot of things from whenever I was a student here that were erased and stuff had been put on top of them. But the story lives up here. So I'm going to present a case where the victors weren't the ones who wrote the history. Can we wrap our minds around that? I mean, you look you're very intelligent, so of course we can. All right, so today's goals. I introduced you to Lampião. Did I do that? I hope so. I don't know if you can pronounce that tilde over the A. Lampião. And you gotta say it like you're very rich. Like Lampião. And then we're going to introduce you to the literature of Cordel, which you've got a little piece of. Does anybody know where it was big? Where the big area was? It's in the Brazilian Northeast. Yeah, great. And then it migrated with the migrants coming out of there. And then discuss how the Cordel has shaped. So right there we have... this is actually a little bit of a teaser. You can see there's a head dangling there. It wasn't all fun and games. Some of it is. There's every type of Cordel you can imagine, just like any poetry, but we're focusing on a corpus, specific ones today. So, I'm going to tell a story. I'm going to read a little prepared script really quick here, all right? Because I like it. I thought I did good, so I got to read it, okay? So, July 28th, day after my wife's birthday. 1938. When federal police forces encircled the Cangaceiro bandits camp in Sergipe, Brazil, in 1938, there was no way to know that the bandit phenomenon that had defied authorities for decades, about 60 years, he was operating 20 years, would for all intents and purposes disappear in just about 2 years after that. A firefight broke out the morning of July 28th, 1938. And those caught in the fatal crossfire included the most famous Brazilian bandits of all, Lampião, called the Hurricane Lamp because at night he could shoot so fast you didn't even need a lamp. His muzzle flare would light up the night. And his girlfriend, Maria Bonita Deia, was killed alongside him. Neither Lampião's lightning-fast pistol nor Maria's beauty could save them, not just from death, but also from becoming part of the spoils of war. In addition to money, trinkets, guns, hats, sundry souvenirs that the victorious police forces collected that day, they surveyed and scrounged around the bandits' campsite. They took ironclad, incontrovertible proof of the death of the bandit king that some said could not be killed. Many times the newspaper said he was dead, and he appeared a couple weeks later. He had not died. Sounds like Mark Twain, right? Not long, they took ironclad proof which sung of his death. And so not long after the successful raid on the bandits' camp, police official João Bezerra and his men left the scene with 11 decapitated heads. Those of Lampião, Maria Bonita, and 9 others. They displayed with pride, taking them on a victory tour of the Brazilian Northeast, hundreds and hundreds of miles on trains. And they eventually went to the capital of Bahia, Salvador, where it stayed in formaldehyde in a jar for 30 years. So, content warning, you can look away. We have a picture. All right? The bottom middle is him. Right above him is probably her. They're so decomposed, it's kind of gross, we don't know. Ready? So yeah, they met up, they set up these huge displays everywhere they went. And what's crazy is, during Lampião's lifetime, I'm passing on, during Lampião's lifetime, they were already writing about him. Within a year of him becoming an official bandit, they were already publishing near daily reports about him in the newspaper, clickbait at the time, because they knew they would sell if they wrote about him. And cordel poets would write about him all the time. What did he just do? So why would poets be writing about him? Well, it's a pretty interesting phenomenon because up in this region where they didn't have a lot of infrastructure, there was roads and whatnot, but there was nobody wanted to make a significant investment, so they basically didn't have, off the coastline, they didn't have any major newspapers. So the poets took it upon themselves to be itinerant travelers, itinerant poets. They went around from open air market to open air market every day of the week, making a poem one day, carving a cover art, stamping it, and printing it out, and then selling it. And they would, to sell it, to stimulate their sales, they would have rap battles, they call pelejas, which are improvised poetry battles where they diss on each other, and whoever the public thought did a better job, they would just buy from that person. So it was a real matter of, will I eat today if my rhymes aren't good enough? And, his palms were sweaty, vomit on his shirt, mom spaghetti type of thing. And it was a lot of stakes going on there. Here's one poet's description of what happened. You can read the translation to the right. As cabeças dos bandidos desceram para Salvador, passando pela cidade do longínquo interior. Era enorme o vai e vem do povo vendo-as no trem, numa expressão de horror. This is a very common style called the setilha, 7-line verse. The two most common are the sextilha, or 6, and the setilha, or the 7-line verses. Almost always the same. And unlike nowadays where we kind of like, okay, we write poetry and it kind of rhymes. Nothing against that. But poetry in cordel is not poetry unless it rhymes. They're very particular. It's one of the, for being a insignificant genre, as the dictionary once said, it is one of the most rigidly controlled. The poets will not accept you if you don't have all your syllables in order. So if you count them on your fingers, you will see that it's very well versified. Okay, so this is from one, it's actually a fairly recent one. It was a winner of a contest. Now, if you want to know more about him, I'm not going to tell you, but there's a good podcast by a famous podcaster, and it's called International Infamy, and it's called Brazil's Bandit King, okay? And it goes into a lot of details, and it's very accurate. And thanks to my dad for letting me know about this one. So you would think for a bandit who evaded capture for nearly 2 decades, who did all these bad things, it'd be an open and shut case, wouldn't you? History says he's a bad guy. Don't you agree? He did a lot of bad stuff. We don't even need to go. Imagine what a bandit could do. He did it and worse, okay? One story they say about him is that, sometimes he was nice. So one day he went to a lady's house. Hey, would you cook me a meal? Me and my men are hungry. There's like 20 of us. I'll do my best, she says. And, she just did what she could with what she had. And one of the men complained that there wasn't enough salt. And Lampião was like, she's given us food. Why would you insult her food? So that was a huge deal. So he said, you want salt? He sent his guys off to the market. He said, bring back a kilo and you're going to eat it till you die. And so that's what he had no problem doing. That scene is played out in a December 2022 Netflix series made about this guy called The Time Traveling Bandit. It's what is it called? O Cangaceiro do Futuro. It's called The Future Cangaceiro, just published on Netflix. It's very funny, farcical, but still funny, and has episodes from his real life and from the cordel. So, basically, I want to talk about Lampião as what they said about him as a bandit, what he looked like as a northeasterner, sertanejo, and how Lampião is used to protect and push Brazilian identity on the world. It's pretty cool. And I've got now a ton of cover art. You ready for this? All right. All right, so what is literatura de cordel? Like I told you before, it's a folk poetry. It started a long time ago. It's in the Northeast. It's because it got popular because they didn't have newspapers, so the poets would do it, and they had to live writing their own poetry. So there was a real imperative behind it. And so, like I said, it became very, very widely read. And you're like, well, who would read it in an undeveloped region? Great question. Well, if there was one person in the family who could read, guess what they would do? They would read it to their family. And then the next day, they would buy more. They were very, very cheap. And today, even to this day, part of the experience of cordel is they use some of the cheapest paper they can, because that's just part of the tradition. So anyways, I think I can just skip this. Like I said, about 1,500 been written about him. And there's everything, every topic, even to some very controversial topics they write about. And even in the 21st century, when something happens in the news, it will be printed in a cordel, even in 2023. And in the city where my wife is from, there's a market, and it's very rare nowadays, but there's a market, and a guy literally lives off of selling these booklets. Doesn't make a great living anymore, but that's his actual job. His livelihood is selling. So could you imagine, like, in Lynchburg, a guy's like, well, I sell poetry, that's my living. That's kind of cool. It still feels like romantic with a big R. So Lampião and cordel, but even by the 60s, people thought the cordel and Lampião were synonymous. This is a famous biopic about him, a scene from like 1964. It was within 25 years after his death or so. And the opening scene is a guy singing about him in the market in front of the cordel. So it's been synonymous with him for 75 years or more at this point. This is a really erudite poem written about him. Whenever they write biographies, I've cataloged easily 100 of them about him. We believe that there are 1,500 total cordels written about him. I've got about 250 to 275 verified known cordels. As far as I know, and I'm going to brush my shoulders off and brag a little bit. As far as I know, it's the largest verified corpus of Lampionic cordels in existence. Nobody has ever tried to figure out what they are, how many there are, where they're located, and what their names are. And because anybody can write a story and publish it on the internet now. And so I've got in the neighborhood of 250 to 275 verified about him, and about 40% of those are straight up biographies about him, his life, or specific events. And so they try to tell the story over and over. Even in 2022, 23, they're publishing new ones about him. So the shortest ones are about 32 stanzas, which of 6 lines, anybody want to do math? Isn't that 196, right? 196 lines written about him. And the longest one is more or less Homeric in length. It's this one, Os Cabras de Lampião, 653 stanzas. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to pass around some of these, and you can look at them, because I know you're not going to have a chance to look at them otherwise. Feel free to take them out, just don't destroy them or whatnot, so that'll be nice. And these are just some ones about him. These are very common. These can be found in just about any. You've seen them before. Okay? Feel free to pass them around. Don't keep them. I'm sorry, don't keep them. They're mine. And this is the big one. It's actually not very new. It's quite old. It's not super, super old. But yeah, it's basically a novel now. There's even a cordel publisher in Rio. But yeah, this one is written, it's got sources and everything. They make sure to cite their sources. The guy who wrote this one he recently died. He's a friend of mine. He was the founder of the Brazilian Academy of Cordel. They have a whole Academy of Letters devoted to this genre of poetry. And it's just, I don't know, it's a really good one, and it's fairly unbiased. And then, of course, we have ones that aren't unbiased, and we'll talk about those in a second. Here's some other ones way back. This was during his life, 1927. He'd only been a bandit for 5 years. Couldn't call for reinforcements. Cut the telegraph pole. Lay siege to the town. Summarily execute the police if he felt like it. Sometimes he would make people engage in dances so he could feel better about himself. Sometimes he'd make them dance naked in the town square. He would do whatever he wanted. And sometimes he felt like a good guy. He would pay them all back for the damages. If he took a mule, he would take it with him, would send it back with a passerby. Make sure this farmer gets his mule back, he would say. So people are always like, well, he's horrible. He executes police. He makes people dance naked in the town square. Oh, but he returned that mule. He returned that mule and he paid for damages. So this one is actually one of the major battles that he lost. And he was injured, and he kind of had to hide out in the desert for a little while to evade police. So Mossoró is a huge stain on his legacy. It's the one time that the cities fought back and beat him. Then we also have, like I said, Os Cabras de Lampião, the 653 epic, stanza epic. This one is how this guy's predicting, he's really bitter at the fact that Lampião was surrounded by the police and still managed to get away. The fact that he could always get away was due to his experience navigating the backlands. He was actually a long-haul freighter. He would carry freight across in carts and whatnot. So he knew the region like the back of his hand. He knew the ways he could escape when surrounded. So this one is Lampião foi cercado. He was surrounded, and yet he got away. This, of course, contributed to his myth. They thought they had him, and nope, slipped through their fingers. Here's another one. This is a really interesting one. When the government realized in about 1926, it was only 1926, they realized that Lampião was becoming a problem. The actual federal government, a couple years later, they're going to try to write a clause into the Constitution to get rid of Lampião. That's how big of a problem is. The new Getúlio Vargas government, which had taken over in an overthrow, tried to make a new constitution to make sure that their government was legitimized. Well, it didn't make it in because you can't put that in a constitution. But yeah, by 1926, there are already problems. This is 4 years into his tenure. And what this is the guy on the right is just a guy, but you see his hat? It's like a normal hat. Well, the most famous picture of Lampião, which is this, the most famous one that everybody uses, you see his hat? It's the circular hat. But on the left is Lampião up there. Sorry if you can't see it. You see how it's that cangaceiro hat, which is up in the front display case, by the way. You can see one just like that. Not that same one, obviously. That'd be worth $1 million. But he actually, for this picture, they made him switch hats. Because they said, if you will stop being a bandit, we will give you the official military title of captain. We will give you all the munitions, guns, bullets, heavy arms that you want. Just stop being a bandit. But you have to take a publicity stunt photo with us. And you got to wait for us to process the paperwork. Well, he took the photo. It became famous. This is the story of that right there. This is Cordel. And guess what happened? The paperwork was delayed. And he was sick of waiting. He just up and took all the guns and bullets and went back to being a bandit. And now he just signed everything, Captain Lampião. Can you believe this? I mean, this is amazing. But then Lampião, we have holding a head. This one is Lampião vai ser pegado, which is actually an antiquated form of the verb, which is now vai ser pego. So this shows like the antiquated language. In fact, it might even be a way that people have said it in an uneducated fashion at the time. This guy's mad. He's like, I know they're going to catch him. They eventually did, but years later. The middle one, these are commentary biographies where they tell the story to get across their viewpoints. The middle one is a guy, I met this guy's family. He died a few years back. And Manuel Monteiro, he is from the town where the cordel really started in Brazil. And this guy is very well respected, and his official take was Lampião was a half-baked hero. Meio tigela is like saying he's a half bull. And so he's like, he's not the full bull. He's one fry short of a happy meal. He is a half-baked hero. And then on the right is this guy, Raimundo Santa Helena. His biographies were always, no, Lampião was nothing but a bloodthirsty madman who killed my dad for no reason and did things to my mom and killed her baby. That's all you need to know. His whole Cordel legacy is that. My mom was this, my dad was that, here's my story. And a lot of his Cordels include newspaper clippings, so you don't just take his word. Like Lamar Burton, like don't just take my word for it. It's an old joke, sorry. But you have to read the art. He said, you have to read my poetry with the newspaper articles. So, then we have biographies that try and justify Lampião. I don't have a whole lot of, they're in every single biography that is not a commentary against him. Every biography comments about how, well, he was justified. You want to know why? Well, he got into a land dispute with a neighbor. He was a lower class rancher, and the guy next to him was a really large cattle baron. And that cattle baron, they got into a dispute over whose cattle was actually belonging to whom. And then some shots broke out and things like that. And then eventually, the cattle baron used his influence to get Lampião arrested. But in the process of arresting him, they surrounded his house and his dad got shot. And that started this whole thing. Like, this feud with a neighbor started all of it. And all of his biographies that are more or less neutral to positive will say he was justified to become a bandit. It's a huge trope in bandit literature. So they have to always find the reason why they became bandits, and they have to blame it on the unstable society created by the higher-ups. Remember how we talked about they're vying for power? Well, the society is already unstable, which is why bandits exist. And then they can blame their existence, not because they're doing bad things, but because they were forced to do bad things, because those higher-ups aren't doing their job. And so all these quotes here say the same thing. He faced injustice. His dad was killed, which, of course, you would react. I don't know if we'd all become bandits because of it, but they all refer to the same events. Now we get to a really interesting one. Lampião is portrayed in fake biographies. He's put up against famous characters from other parts of the cordel. There's this famous whole trope in the cordel where they have animals, humans who do something wrong, and as punishment for their sins, they become an animal. There's this girl who smacks her mom, she becomes a dog. Then this boy, he does something wrong, he becomes a goat. And so they become these, like, it's just superstitious, you know. You just want to, if you do that, your eye's going to stay that way type of thing. If you do that, you'll turn into a dog. And that's the stories they tell, and it becomes cordel. Well, now Lampião actually faces them, because these people are bad kids, so they're going to see if they can face up and get taught a real lesson. Becoming a goat isn't a lesson enough. You got to be humiliated as a goat by Lampião. Okay? So there's a whole bunch of them. And there was one author in particular who's an amazing carver. His name is José Costa Leite, and you'll see a bunch of his. He just wrote a bunch of these. And so here's some of them. This one is the fight of Lampião with the pharaoh, the savage beast. This one is the mother of Satan against Lampião. This one is the leopard of Pajeú against Lampião. And then the one over there is the one I just told you about, the girl that became a dog. And the reason why she became a dog is because she didn't believe in God, and in doing so, when she was mad at her mom for saying, "You can't say that," she's like, "Yes, I can." I was like, okay, she probably deserved that, but to become a dog, yeah, maybe. But yeah, there's a whole series. Look, it's all the same author. He was very much obsessed with them. And there's more of them too. Then, my favorite, Alien and Predator versus Lampião. I mean, how much better do you get this? I mean, can you believe it's gone Hollywood? It's gone Hollywood. Isn't this amazing? Like, we have this guy. Doesn't even matter what he did anymore in life. No, it matters the fact that he's being reincarnated hundreds and thousands of times in poetry. And he still sells. He still sells. And then, the loving bandits. This is all in the biography trope. All of these are biographies. Now we have whenever he's up beside Maria Bonita. So we have the biographies that tell both their story, and they always end up just telling his story. She always plays second fiddle. And here we go. We have this one where supposedly Lampião goes to hell, and he's trying to get Maria Bonita out of hell because they were both going to hell. And so, but Satan wants to keep her, so he kidnaps her into hell. And so he doesn't see it happen, so he thinks she just broke up with him. And he's despondent. And the reaction he says is, well, I'll read it in English this time. He called out for Maria, running toward the garden. He said, "She left me. This is my sad end. I'm captive by her love. What's the reason from above for her to leave me then?" And he didn't know. Satan kidnapped her. But we see, he's a bad guy, but look at it, how much he loves her. He loves her so much. He went to hell for her. Then we also have, he goes back to the Garden of Eden in the beginning of time. He has a really back and forth discussion with a clothesless Adam pre-fall, because then the fall happens while Lampião was there, which is a whole other thing. Lampião says, "Oh, so you've got a girl? I do too." She's like, "Well, mine, I guarantee, is better than yours." And of course, they get into a battle. And again, even God's perfect creation cannot match, in Lampião's eyes, cannot sway Lampião's opinion, because he has to be the eternal good lover to Maria Bonita. And if you look up in the display case up there, they're sitting on a park bench together, and as a souvenir. Many, many souvenirs now are just those two holding hands and looking cute together. You can go to, in this one state, there's a market, and they have a picture, you put your head in there, and you stand there, and they're like Maria Bonita and Lampião, and you and your girlfriend or boyfriend can be those two. Now they're like the exemplary pair of Northeastern folk culture. And how they became that is through poetry. Then we have other ones, again, like I said, biographies of them both. Just look at them all. It's crazy. Then we have mythic biographies where then Adam and Eve instead are replaced by Lampião and Maria Bonita. So not that they just talk to them, they become them. So there's huge intertextuality here. That one there, where he goes to hell to find her, is where she gets kidnapped. Then we have this one where it's just a biography about him, but to sell more, they know they can put her on the picture, on the cover, and they'll sell more. Look at the one in the middle. It's so dramatic. It's the death of Lampião, but this actually never happened. They were killed almost simultaneously, though some accounts say that she was beheaded alive, and she was suffering from her gunshot wound when it happened. We're not sure. We can never verify that, but we do know that they were not close enough for her to be hugging and crying over him. But still, the picture sells the poem. That's really, really well said. The picture sells the poem. Then we have, this is just small biographical information about Lampião, but if she has to be there. That picture actually is very famous because although he's supposed to be the perfect lover, if you look closely, it's a swimsuit picture issue of a newspaper. We know exactly what newspaper, what day it was, and we have the digital facsimile. So at the same time, he's like, look at me, I'm in the desert with her, and I'm the perfect guy, and she's the perfect woman. I still can do what I want. I'm a man, and I can do what I want. And so he's giving, this was taken during a documentary film being made in 1936. Excuse me. And then again, there she is in the background. We got some honorable mentions, how he had to choose between love and banditry. And I got to end very soon, I know. Then we have the story of how they fell in love. Then we have the ABC cycles. ABCs are whenever the first letter of each stanza begins with another letter of the alphabet in sequential order. It goes back to the Psalms, actually, even further perhaps. But we have Psalms that are ABCs as well, but obviously not in English. And so they have a different stanza about them. And then she gets her own cordel. Then we have him as a model sertanejo. Oh man, I gotta go. This is the best one. I think I'm gonna just end on this because I don't want to keep going. But this is the most famous one. Conservative estimates say that it's sold well over 1 million copies and dozens, if not hundreds, of reprints. And it's been many, many different cover arts. It's only 8 pages, 32 stanzas long. But in this one, Lampião goes to hell, and he has a dog fight. He has a fight with the forces, literal forces of hell himself. And why would he fight with hell? Well, he wants to get into hell because that's where he should be. He's like, that's where I belong. I'm the bad guy. And Satan says, well, because you did some nice things, you're not bad enough to go into hell. So we don't want you here. You're not bad enough for hell. And okay, so Lampião's like, I am bad enough, and I'll prove by beating you. And so they have a big gunfight. Lampião jumps around, and Lampião versus all the forces of hell. He kills everybody or makes them run tail between their legs. And Satan says, fine, do what you want. And he's like, I changed my mind. I'm not going to spend my eternity with a loser. And so he goes back to the Brazilian desert because one of the main tropes one of the main characteristics that they say in all the literature about the sertanejo person, about the literature when they write it, is that you love the sertão to the end. If you leave it on what they call the pau-de-araras, are these like, when you emigrate away, these people who left the Northeast looking for new opportunities in the South, in Rio and Sao Paulo, they never forgot the Northeast. They brought the cordel with them. They set up new markets in the South. Even though they left the Northeast, they never left it out of their hearts. So if you're a model sertanejo, you have to remember the sertão. So, I mean, this is one. He meets up with another sertanejo in heaven, and he helps him get into heaven this time. So he goes to heaven. Then he makes a mess there. Then, I mean, look at all of them. He's doing everything. Then this one, it says that Lampião never died in the hearts of all the Northeasterners. He's still alive in their hearts, which is pretty clear. Here he writes a letter to Saddam Hussein and says, stop being such a wicked man. And it takes the Brazilian bandits to fix the world's problems, Saddam Hussein. So Brazil out there doing the dirty work for the rest of the world. He's the protector of Brazil and the promoter of Brazilian superiority and identity. Then we have, well, sometimes you have to take the fight to your own front door. The National Congress, he says, you're too much infighting and too much corruption. I'm going to come to you all now. He goes to the Congress building and he shows them a thing or two to whip the Congress in line. I think we can identify sometimes too much infighting and too much corruption, I guess, yeah. Definitely need to teach them a lesson. And then he said they're mafia politicians. I mean, he should talk, I guess, but then I keep saying I'm gonna stop, but man, there's so many. The one in the middle, I think is probably the one of the most fun because it talks about stereotypes about us in the United States, which is he gets into a debate with a woman who's a tourist in Brazil. And what do you think she's described as? She's an atheist feminist. And the big thing, he says, no. I'm going to teach you to learn to like men and to learn to trust in God. And that's the whole point of the poem. And I was like, isn't that interesting that that's what they think of, that this poet thinks about the culture? I just thought that was interesting. So there's plenty of examples here, like I can show you. But ultimately, my conclusion boils down to the fact that Lampião is a rare case where those on the margins have rewritten or refashioned history as they saw it. It wasn't the official discourses that are winning. It's not them that are winning out. There's debates all the time about this. An extensive study of cordel representation reveals the extent of these trends, which I've only begun to look at. And at the very least, he's a bandit in every sense of the word, in hundreds, or at least 100 biographies. He's then an exemplary sertanejo who represents sertanejo values. And then from time and again, he has a voice for Brazil, who defends it, who promotes their values, promotes them on the world stage. And sometimes even has to save Brazil from itself. And so I'm going to leave you with a quote here by someone I know. His name is Franklin Machado. And it says, Lampião, é o doutor Amauri, which is a famous scholar, que estuda Lampião, diz que o herói nunca morre, principalmente no sertão. And this, I think, sums up exactly his legacy, which says, the Dr. Amauri, who studies Lampião, says that heroes never die, especially in the sertão. Thank you so much. I really had a great time. Hope you did too.